Hey friends, today we're going to be talking about witches,
Let's brew another batch.
snitches, and your personal favorite, execution. So the colonial region that we'll be discussing today is the New England Colonies. But before we get to that, let's back up and do a quick recap. You already know that a colony is a settlement that's controlled by a larger, more powerful parent country. After the Europeans realized that there was a whole new world of unclaimed territory in the Americas, several countries raced across the Atlantic Ocean to claim some of that land for their countries. One of those countries was England, and its first major attempt at setting up a colony was at Roanoke. We know that the colony of Roanoke was an epic failure, not once, but twice, and nobody really knows what happened to the settlers the second time around. Then we learned about Jamestown, which was the first successful English colony in the New World, and that was all because John Smith took over and basically said, if you don't work, you don't eat.
But there is no gold.
Finally, we learned about the colony of Plymouth and how the Pilgrims came over to the New World in an effort to practice their Puritan religion in peace. Before they got off the Mayflower, they signed a document called the Mayflower Compact, which made sure that there was some kind of government structure so that everything didn't erupt into chaos and the purge didn't happen.
Anything goes.
Okay, so now that you're up to speed, let's dive into the actual New England colonies. The New England colonies were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Remember that the present-day states of Maine and Vermont were also on that land of the New England colonies, but Vermont was not a colony, and what is today Maine was actually part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Before we get into the witches and the execution and all that stuff that you can't wait to hear about, let's talk about that region as a whole. Because it was the farthest from the equator, it was the coldest of the three major regions of the 13 colonies. It had the shortest growing season, and it had the least religious tolerance. Remember that religious tolerance is when you allow people to practice whatever religion they want. So if we had to characterize the New England colonies, I would name them Karen.
What's so hard about everyone doing what I think they should be doing?
Most of the people in the New England colonies had very, very hardcore beliefs and were not tolerant of anything that deviated from those. People in the New England colonies often wanted to speak to the manager, except that the manager was God. So the first New England colony that we're going to talk about is Massachusetts. The main thing you need to know about Massachusetts is that the Salem witch trials happened here. During the Salem witch trials, a bunch of people were thrown into jail and executed for being witches.
A bunch of girls started acting erratically, and a doctor checked them out, and he said, these girls are bewitched.
Some of the signs that would cause people to suspect you of witchcraft could be red hair, moles or birthmarks, or being too outspoken, or a woman. I fit a lot of that criteria. Some of the punishments for those witches included hanging, jail time, being put in the stocks, the witch's cradle, and of course, pressing to death. Remember that society was way more religious back then, and you could be accused of sinful behavior just because you fell asleep in church. It's kind of odd to think that these people who were obsessed with their religion could justify killing people for witchcraft. But you have to understand that they thought they were doing God's work by getting the devil out of their society. The main thing about these witch trials was that pretty much anything you did could put you under suspicion of witchcraft, whether it was the way that you acted or who you were friendly with or related to. If you were accused of being a witch, you sometimes got a lesser punishment if you snitched on other people, which led to more accusations. Unfortunately, the trials targeted the people who were seen as weaker in the society, especially women. Remember that the Puritans came to Massachusetts for religious freedom, but then didn't allow it for anybody else and banished anyone who disagreed with them. Take Roger Williams, for example. Roger Williams wanted to have religious tolerance in the colony of Massachusetts and pay Native Americans for their land, and he was banished. Anne Hutchinson said the very controversial statement that women could read and understand the Bible.
It's not right for a woman to read. Soon she starts getting ideas and thinking.
She was also banished, went to Rhode Island, then later to New York, where unfortunately she was killed by Native Americans, and the governor of Massachusetts said that it was God's will. Moving right along from Massachusetts, the next New England colony that we're going to be talking about is New Hampshire. So the main thing that I want you to remember about New Hampshire was that there was no slave tariff. Remember that a tariff is a tax on imports, or goods that you're bringing into a country. Because there was no slave tariff in New Hampshire, many slaves were imported through New Hampshire and then smuggled into the other colonies. This was part of triangular trade, where slaves were shipped from Africa to the New World, resources were obtained from the New World, and then shipped to Europe, where they were manufactured into goods and shipped to Africa. During this time period, it's not very often that you hear about women doing big things. However, in New Hampshire, there was Hannah Duston. Remember that the Native Americans, particularly those in Canada who were helping the French, didn't really love the colonists. So the French were basically trying to get the land that was New Hampshire, and they had Native Americans helping them to do so. In this process, a woman named Hannah Duston and her baby were kidnapped by Native Americans who were trying to take them back to Canada. They killed Hannah Duston's baby, and you don't mess with the mama and her baby. Hannah Duston and a couple of other people killed and scalped 10 Native Americans and escaped to safety. Remember that scalping is basically like peeling an orange, but with a human.
Cut through the skin, and then you should just be able to peel the skin right off.
The third colony that we are going to talk about today is Connecticut. One of the biggest industries in colonial Connecticut was the whaling industry. Whales were used for a lot of different things, but two of the main things that they were used for was whale oil, used for oil lamps, and whale bone, which was used for corsets. The other thing to remember about Connecticut was the first written constitution in the colonies was called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut made laws for taxes, elections, and courts. The key thing to remember about this document was that it only allowed white male landowners to vote. When I was a child and well into my teen years, every time my family went to a restaurant, when the waitress would come up and ask us for our drink orders, my mom would say, "We'll all have water." Because there was never any soda in our house, I would be crushed every time she made this decision for me. I'm sure you can relate to this, and I want you to think about how on a much larger scale, how these people who were not white, or who were not male, or who did not own property felt that these other people were making important decisions for them, and they couldn't do anything about it just because of their gender or the color of their skin or whether or not they owned land. The final colony that we are going to discuss today is Rhode Island. It was the only New England colony that actually had religious tolerance. Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams after he was banished from Massachusetts and went to live with Native Americans in Providence. But before you think this colony was perfect, it definitely wasn't. Rhode Island still had slaves. Now, Rhode Island was the first colony to make some kind of rule to regulate slavery, saying that you couldn't import slaves anymore and anyone who was enslaved must be given freedom after 10 years. But those rules were not really enforced. If you found this video helpful or you want extra credit in my class, please like it and subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for a quick recap on what I just talked about.